Welcome to First Bite, our Detroit Lions midweek podcast where we bring in a guest to talk all things Detroit Lions. We are just about ready to start our draft pick series where we get to know each individual draft pick. But before that, we're doing a recap show. My name is Jeremy Reisman, by the way. I'm the producer over at Pride of Detroit. With me, as always, for First Bite, to co-host the whole ship is senior editor of Pride of Detroit at Ryan_POD on Twitter. Ryan Matthews is here. What's up, buddy?
What is up, man? How many recap shows can we do?
All of them.
One more, because we have a special guest.
That's right. You know him, you love him. He's been part of the show plenty of times, especially during draft season. He's the director of fantasy points data and research over at Fantasy Points, formerly of PFF, co-host of the Take Talk pod, also the host of On the Clock podcast. Brett Whitefield is back. Brett, welcome back, buddy. How you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Finally starting to recover. Family unfortunately came down with like strep throat late on day 2 of the draft. And I was in the middle of back-to-back 6-hour streams, so it was a long weekend to say the least. But I think we're on the other side. Everyone's on the come up. We're doing a lot better. So things are looking up from here, man.
Yeah, I mean it's been a full week. I think everyone's starting to get their sleep back from that 3-night marathon here. But let's get into it, Brett. Basically, I want to run through every pick, see what your thoughts are. We had a lot of your thoughts before the draft. I think the Lions ended up getting a couple people that you really like. Maybe a lot of people that you really like, but maybe not just in the order that you were hoping for. So let's start with that divisive day one and Jahmyr Gibbs, because I believe you're in my corner when it comes to running back value in the first round. But before we even get into that argument, I want you to talk about him as a player, because I know you actually have a very high grade on Jahmyr Gibbs.
Yeah. So what's funny, Jeremy, is I didn't know just how high that grade was until after the draft. My analytics guy, my right-hand guy at Fantasy Points, Chris Wecht, he's been trying to take my draft grades over, because I've been doing it for 9 years now, and try to see like what's predictive, what's not, what positions am I weak at. We're figuring all that data out. So he had me compile all 9 years of running back grades, and we're going through them. And then bold discovery, Jahmyr Gibbs is my 5th highest graded running back ever since 2015 or whatever. So sandwich between Saquon Barkley and Todd Gurley. So Gibbs is obviously a fantastic player. I think he's lived in the Bijan shadow this entire draft cycle.
Yeah,
Bijan is just such an exceptional talent, and unfortunately for Gibbs, like, he kind of is the forgotten about guy. When in one thing I found from my grades is like my grades actually are really predictive when it comes to draft capital, and in that range that Gibbs is in, every single one of those guys has been a first round pick or even a top 10 pick. So I think from that standpoint, we maybe should have predicted Gibbs going a little bit higher than I did. I did have him in the first round, but had him at the back of the first round. He was the 27th overall player on my board. But as far as like a skill set, I mean, I think everyone kind of knows what Gibbs is at this point. He is a dynamic pass game weapon. He's a guy you can play in the slot. You can play wide receiver. That's not hyperbole either. A lot of GMs, when they draft a running back too high, they justify it right away by saying he's not just a running back. It's actually true for Gibbs. He played almost 100 snaps, split out in a wide receiver position last year at Alabama. He ran like 80 routes from those positions. So this is a guy who actually was used that way, which is rare for the college level for a running back to get that kind of versatile usage. So he is the way that Brad has talked about him. Like, he is legitimately not just a running back. He will be a pass game weapon. Probably not ever going to be a bell cow guy at 200 pounds, but he's a dude that has elite elusiveness, lateral quickness, acceleration, all the athletic measurables you look for in a dynamic running back. And then he pairs that with like phenomenal vision, phenomenal ability to make guys miss. I mean, I think what's interesting about this draft class is they got 2 guys in Sam LaPorta and Gibbs, and obviously we'll get to LaPorta in a little bit, but 2 guys that are just incredible in the open field. And this is kind of the players that Goff really needs to be successful. The accurate short throws, get those guys in space, use scheme to get these guys the ball, and then see what happens from there. So
I have kind of like a macro question for you, Brett, in the sense of what the Lions have done with their running back position this offseason. There was a tweet from Greg Rosenthal. It was like, I think it was after day 1, but it was something like the difference between Jamal Williams and DeAndre Swift and David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, like, isn't that big.
It was one of the worst tweets I've ever seen.
Okay, yeah. So can you at least expand on? We'll put the Jamal Williams and David Montgomery thing on the side table. Tell me what the what the selling point is on Gibbs being the back that unlocks this offense versus DeAndre Swift.
Yeah, so Swift, a couple things about Swift. One, we know about the toughness concerns that was well documented on Hard Knocks last year. It didn't get better, right? He obviously was pretty banged up, and when he was on the field in those moments, he didn't play particularly well. He also sat out some games. Toughness aside, though, Gibbs, he is what DeAndre Swift is. Actually, my working comp for him, I don't know if you follow Scott Barrett on Twitter, but he always tweets my funniest comps every year. So my working comp for DeAndre Swift for Jahmyr Gibbs, if he was DeAndre Swift taking like TRT or some type of heavy steroid usage.
Careful, we don't need another suspension, Brett.
But I mean, his skill set is very similar to Swift's. Obviously, it's just a little bit more juiced up. It's like 10% more. It's like if he had an infinity gauntlet and he got one of the stones, like that's Jahmyr Gibbs, you know? So, but they do a lot of the same things. One thing I never really liked about Swift is I think he had really bad hands. Mm-hmm. We saw this anytime he got a target, like downfield, like that wasn't just at the line of scrimmage. He bobbled the ball a lot. He had a couple drops. Remember, was it may have been his first game in the Lions uniform.
Very first game, the wheel route.
I mean,
against the Bears, yep, game winner,
game losing drop. Right there. So, and that, you know, it didn't manifest in a ton of drops, but I just feel like they were never comfortable throwing him the ball downfield, which is why he didn't get used on a lot of deeper routes. Gibbs is not like that. Gibbs has his natural like receiver hands, and he just does everything that Swift does, just a little bit better, a little bit more elusive, a little bit more electric, a little bit faster, breakaway speed. I mean, just really like an upgraded version of Swift. And that's, you know, not including the toughness aspect, which I think the fact that Gibbs should be more available itself makes him a more valuable player.
I want two things on the positional value stuff, and then we'll move on to the next guy. Yeah. First is, do you think there was an upgrade from Swift later in this draft that would have been worth it, seeing that a guy like A-Chain and Tyjae Spears go, late second, early third, or whatever it was? Would that have been better value for that pick? And then to go back, was there a pick that you would have much preferred either at 6 or after the trade down to 12?
All right, let me handle the second question first.
Okay.
So the issue, when people talk about positional value, I think a lot of people that like analytics just throw that term out there and they don't really know why it matters. But they're convicted in it, and they're right. It does matter. But the reason it matters is because of the way you construct a roster. So, for example, the moment Gibbs was drafted in the slot he becomes the 12th highest paid running back in the NFL. So, conversely, if they were to take JSN there, Jackson Smith and Jigba, he's the 43rd highest paid wide receiver in the NFL. The surplus value now that you're getting at those positions is so far out of whack. For Gibbs to get even close to net zero for what they're paying him, he has to dramatically outperform his draft slot. JSN has to modestly perform in that draft slot to get 43rd highest paid receiver value. Not to mention the fact that receivers are more valuable to an offense than running backs in general. You start combining that, like, it's a pretty obvious reason these conversations are happening. The NFL has clearly stated that receivers are more valuable than running backs. Just look at the way they're paid compared to running backs. Yeah, I think that gets lost in the shuffle. I don't hear enough people talking about the surplus value and how roster construction actually works. Right. So that said, the trade back from 6 to 12 is the saving grace for the Gibbs pick, honestly, because that got them another premium pick. When the Gibbs pick happened, I was furious. Like, there's actually a compilation video that was made by our producer at Fantasy Points that will come out this week of me going through the range of emotions I did during the draft. From throwing my headset to jumping up and down because of Hendon Hooker and all kinds of crazy stuff. But I was mad, like completely speechless. And then the more I thought about it, I don't want to say I like 180'd. I'm not like, ooh, what a great pick. I've come to terms with it though, and it makes sense. The Campbell pick is the one I'm furious about, but we'll get to that in a minute. The player I would have taken though at that spot is probably JSN or Christian Gonzalez.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get into the fury then here. Jack Campbell. Let's again start with the player itself, because I don't think anyone can say they weren't surprised that the Lions fell in love with this guy just because of both what he did on the field and because who he is as a competitor, as a person. So, what do you like? What do you don't like about Jack Campbell, the prospect?
Yes, we were kind of talking about it before the show, but this is like a really hard draft class to like evaluate unbiasedly because they didn't draft any players I don't like.
Yeah.
I like Jack Campbell. He was my linebacker one in the draft class. Or at least number one Mike linebacker in the draft class. When you read my scouting profile on him, you're like, oh, wow, this sounds like a really fun player, like a good player. But it's just it comes back to positional value. And I hate to do this again, but it's like Jack Campbell is immediately a top 25 paid linebacker in the NFL the day he was drafted. If they would have taken Miles Murphy there or Kalijah Cansey, Murphy would have been the 57th highest paid edge defender. Kalijah Cansey would have been in the high 40s for defensive tackles. It's like, there's so much surplus. Those guys wouldn't have, like, even if they're just become above average players, you're getting value out of that rookie contract. To get value out of Jack Campbell now, he's got to be a freaking stud from the day he steps on the field.
Yeah.
Not quite to the extent Gibbs does, of course, but he's got to be at least a plus starter for you. So, but
well, go ahead. Well, go ahead.
I was just going back to the player Campbell. Like, the reason I don't love off the ball linebackers from a positional value standpoint is they don't affect the pass game enough. There's 3 linebackers in the NFL that I would consider good, like good math changers in the pass game. It's Bobby Wagner, Levante David, Fred Warner. Unless you have one of those guys, every dollar beyond league average you're paying them isn't worth it. The linebacker position is so hard to play. All you really need is average bodies there. We talked about this on the pre-draft show, right, Jeremy? Yeah. Like, what these guys are asked to do down in and down out is insane. On one down, you are taking on a guard, having to stack and shed him and make a tackle at the line of scrimmage. On the next play, you're covering a slot receiver in space and like in some type of match coverage zone. On the next play, you're covering an athletic tight end in man coverage running downfield at them. There's not people that can do all of these things together. And then maybe on 3rd and 11, now you're part of the pass rush package and you have to have a good pass rush move, get home on a quarterback. The amount of players that can do all of these things and juggle all of these responsibilities is really low. There's a reason linebacker play in the NFL is dreadful across the board. I mean, it's one of the worst positions in the NFL collectively. And that's why everyone's chasing unicorns, right? Like, so why Tremaine Edmonds is getting $20 million a year. And these are not good players. Like, Devin White is not a good player in Tampa Bay. People, for some reason, go nuts over his skill set. And when you put on the tape, he is their liability in pass coverage. Like, every single play, go back to the playoffs last year and the year before, or 2 years ago, and now the year before that. Anytime a team needed a first down, they went at Devin White. Tremaine Edmonds in Buffalo, same thing. Kansas City, when they were in the playoff game, the one that went to overtime, every single crucial down, they attacked Tremaine Edmonds. And that's the problem with linebacker in the NFL. So it's a big miss from that standpoint. You could have got similar production in the 3rd round, I think.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I think a lot of people see Jack Campbell's RAS card and they see a lot of green and they see a big number, Brett. I think you turn on the tape and you see a guy who's a little bit stiffer than that, right? And is that the concern? Because the 3 guys that you just listed, those are incredibly athletic guys too, but it seems like they move a little bit different than Campbell. Is that your biggest concern?
Yeah, he's definitely not even close to the athlete he tested as. Some of it could be reactionary quickness in the pass game. Like, I think his instincts in the run game are phenomenal. Like, he diagnoses and triggers very quickly. In the pass game, though, everything speeds up for him. He can't handle the speed of that. But even when he's moving, like, his range is semi-limited. I don't know if you've noticed. I don't know how much tape you guys have watched, but when he's pursuing a ball carrier, he has to really, really close the distance to get within their range because he doesn't have the explosiveness to make a tackle from long distance. It's a little abnormal to, like, if you compare him to like a Dayan Henley from Washington State. Like, Henley can tackle a guy from freaking 15 yards away because he's so explosive. Like, he closes in a hurry. Campbell doesn't have that closing speed. And that is a concern. I don't think he's a bad athlete by any means, by the way. I'm not saying that. I just don't think he's even close to the elite athlete he tested as, functionally at least. So obviously those numbers aren't fake. So
right. All right, let's move on to day 2. Let's talk a little Sam LaPorta. This was a pick that I was kind of meh on when it first happened, but the more I kind of dove into the tape, the more I'm like, oh, we got another offensive weapon here, and maybe a big one. So, where did LaPorta rank on your tight end rankings to begin with, and how do you think he fits into the Lions offense?
So I always say this with a caveat, but in my generic vertical board, you got to remember I'm stacking this for if I was evaluating generically for all 32 teams.
Right.
If you were then to start to parse that out and stack a board for each team, certain players would get ranks higher, some would fall, some would get pulled off completely because of scheme or whatever. LaPorta was a guy that makes a lot more sense for the Lions than other teams because the way they play on offense. That said, he was my tight end 4 behind Michael Mayer. Mayer was my tight end 3, so he was right there. For the Lions, though, I would probably flip those two. They don't seem to have a need for a guy like Mayer. But LaPorta, from a skill set standpoint, I mean, tremendously gifted route runner. He's pretty technical already. I was only offense. He's a guy that can use him out wide. They can use him in the slot, in the backfield, in line. He's a tad undersized, but all these tight ends coming in this year were pretty small, actually. Kincaid was small. Mayer gets billed as this big, strong run blocker guy. He's only 250 pounds. Like that's not that big. Yeah. Musgrave and Washington were the caveats there. They're super big, but everyone else is, Will Mallory's 240 pounds. So like I think he's the modern tight end. This is the size you're going for. But on top of that route running, you're getting insane run after the catch ability. And I'm excited to see what Ben Johnson does with him and getting the ball in his hands and letting him meet that way. Yeah, so I was comfortable with the pick, Jeremy. The thing that made me go cross-eyed, though, is I was like, oh, my God, they're literally doing this to spite me. They went running back, linebacker, tight end in a row. Like, holy crap, you can't like, throw the positional value. It's almost intentional. Like, we're so anti-analytics. We're just going to, do everything we can to spite you guys. So that's how it felt.
Is there anything to the point, though, like that if you find unicorns at this position, if they're so resolved in these guys, and like you mentioned with Campbell, there's only like 2 or 3, 4 guys, and I know you probably don't think Campbell's going to grow into one of those guys because 1, the odds are against him, and 2, you just mentioned the athleticism. But is there value in finding such rare talent at positions where you don't have there isn't a lot of those guys?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if Campbell turned into Bobby Wagner, no one's going to look back and be like, that was a terrible pick.
Right.
Stupid positional value, man. Yeah, I mean, LaPorta, because he is such a pass game weapon, it's not your traditional tight end conversation where this he's basically a slot receiver. I mean, right. In a lot of ways he is. So I think it's a little bit easier of a sell because of that. Same with Gibbs to an extent. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, hey, let's throw all of the talk about like bad positional value, all of that right out the window, and go to pick 45, which I know like everybody loved, right? I feel like that was the turning of the tide for the entire Lions draft. It's almost like every national analyst was like, oh, forget about the 3 picks. Look at all the value they got from Brian Branch. And I know you love Brian Branch, so can you just tell us why?
Yeah, for sure. So the LaPorta pick kind of perked me up a little bit. I was like, okay, I see that. I like that. Okay.
Yeah.
Branch pick happened, and I was freaking through the moon, man.
Pants off. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. And I mean, I wrote in my profile on Branch that I thought he was the safest player in this entire draft. And it felt like they were trying to be safe with Gibbs and Campbell. Like, hey, we got high marks on these guys. Might be a little early, but it doesn't matter. They're the top guys on our board. Well, Branch for sure checks that box, and he plays a premium position as a slot corner. But everything he does from a leadership standpoint, from an instinct standpoint, like this, there's been a lot of talk this offseason on football Twitter about like missed assignments and how valuable it is to find guys who don't miss assignments. Brian Branch, I don't think missed a freaking single assignment last year. I'm not kidding. Like, he is so dialed into what he's supposed to do, what every guy's role on defense is. It is actually unbelievable to watch. Those instincts are crazy. The fact that he gives you so much versatility too. And, it seems like they're loading up on guys that can do that with, Cam Sutton, Will Harris, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, now Branch. It's just, it provides the defense a ton of value. And my comp for him actually was Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. So getting both those guys together is really interesting.
Yeah. Is there a reason why he slipped, Brett, do you think? Like, I mean, you talked about it a little bit there, but like, I mean, he, 44 picks go by. Brian Branch isn't off the board. This was a guy who was like consensus, like high teens guy.
You can say the 40 maybe is an obvious thing. Like, for teams that view him as a cornerback or a slot corner, the 40 can be a little concerning. Like, maybe you're not going to be able to play man against Tyreek Hill. That would be a stupid ask anyways. Um,
Yeah, right.
but then for the teams that have him viewed as like a safety, well, positional value starts to come in. You know, safeties traditionally don't go off the board unless they're really special until the second round, second, third round, which we saw. There was like a run on safeties like shortly after Branch went off the board. So, um, yeah, those would be the only things I can think of. I do one thing I love about Branch. He was invited to the draft.
Yeah.
He was one of what 3 players that didn't get drafted, or 4 players. The other 3 went home, and Brian Branch stayed there to walk across that stage. That's the most Lions Dan Campbell thing ever, by the way. Like, I just love that. Like as soon as I saw that, I was like, yep, he just proved all the character stuff right there. Just being a guy, he did not care about the embarrassment, wanted to hear his name called, and I think those other guys will regret not walking across that stage.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting you bring up the smarts, right? Because I feel like that is something that I think the Lions have targeted hard this offseason. And you'd understand why, right? A lot of their struggles in the past 2 years on this defense were miscommunication issues. There were people not on the same page. And so you get a guy like Cam Sutton to be a captain of your defensive backfield. And now you got another really, really smart guy that Nick Saban said only great things about. So